sums it up.
Good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Medusa's crown. Okay, now we've got the central compositional element in, the rye woman and the stalk. So now is going to be a sort of a trickier session. I'm going to take faces. Where's my hand? There we go. And interlock them in a spiral, wrapping around the moon and growing larger as they spiral away from it. So, and that'll set up a lot of work. But I would like to do that. They're going to be in very detailed yet subtle. So I want the highlight catching them up from the nose and the cheekbones emanating from the source of the moon. But to start with, we're just going to lay them in with a fairly opaque phthalo blue cut with about a third as much white to make a sort of a bright electric blue. So here we go.
But we have found that as far as mental life is concerned, biochemistry and biophysics have no authority. The opinion, therefore, which seems to me most justifiable, is that life in all its forms is the phenomenal disturbance created in the world of matter and energy when mind comes into it. Living matter is the outward and visible sign of the presence of mind, the splash made by the entry of mental existence into the sea of matter. And he concludes this essay by saying, the biochemist and the biophysicist can and must be thoroughgoing mechanists, but they need not on that account hesitate to say with Sir Thomas Browne, there is something in us that can be without us and will be after us. Now, I quote this in order to show that the transmission theory is a perfectly live theory at the present time, and that there is, philosophically, it seems to be better founded perhaps than the production theory. That there is no compulsion for us to accept the production theory, and therefore no compulsion for us to accept a theory which means that ESP or even IPA are things which make no sense. They do make sense in terms of a transmission theory. Now, the transmission theory obviously is related to the old Platonic and Cartesian theories, but is considerably more subtle, say, than the Cartesian theory. Descartes postulated the relationship of mind and matter in a much too limited way. He spoke of mind as being something whose essence is consciousness, being related to matter whose essence is extension, and each mind being completely watertight and separated from all other minds. But of course now we are able to see that his cogito ergo sum, his I think therefore I am, should be really modified as von Baader, the romantic German philosopher of the early 19th century, modified it, when he said that cogito ergo sum should be revised, and we should say cogitor ergo sum. I am thought, therefore I am. We are thought by an immensely much larger subliminal mind than this conscious ego of which we are aware. And in any kind of reasonable and realistic transmission theory, we have to postulate, I think, that this subliminal mind in which our self-conscious ego floats, so to speak, like a kind of crystal within a sea, within a solution. This subliminal mind is not cut off from all other minds, that it communicates somehow with all other minds in a kind of psychic medium, and that we are, in a certain sense, like crystals floating within this medium and communicating with other crystals through the medium. Well, Bergson accepted this view and maintained that intrinsically the mind was virtually omniscient, and that it was not in fact omniscient here and now, because for the benefit of the animal who has to survive on the surface of this planet, we cannot be omniscient, because we should be so full of irrelevant information that we should simply not be able to get out of the way of the cars in the street. And consequently the nervous system, central nervous system in the brain, exists in order to limit this virtually endless quantity of consciousness which we virtually have, to limit it and to funnel it through for the purposes of biological survival on the surface of this particular planet. Well, my own feeling is I would think this idea of a completely omniscient mind seems to me a little fantastic. But I would think that there is something to be said for a view which would say that this psychic medium, whatever it may be, is, let us say, virtually omniscient, that it could take on into itself every kind of specialized information, but what it is in itself is a kind of undifferentiated consciousness. And as I shall try to point out later on in this lecture, there is a lot of evidence on the part of the mystics, both East and West, to the effect that our particular specialized, individualized consciousness is underlain by an undifferentiated consciousness, and that this undifferentiated consciousness possesses what the Catholic mystics call obscure knowledge. This is a very curious and interesting phrase which we meet with very frequently in the literature of mysticism. They speak, the mystics constantly speak of this obscure knowledge of the world, which is not a particular knowledge of how to make sulfuric acid or what is the distance of the nearest fixed star and so on. It is a generalized knowledge in the individual, an awareness of this total underlying awareness which, as I say, underlies all particular awarenesses. That this obscure knowledge of the universe is, I think, a direct awareness of the undifferentiated consciousness, mentoid state, which underlies all particular consciousnesses. Now, we exist within this undifferentiated awareness as, so to speak, a succession of vortices in a liquid. We have, unfortunately, our psychological vocabulary is so extremely poor that we are always driven back to use these material and spatial metaphors. But we must always remember that when we use material and spatial metaphors, that we use them that they are necessarily very misleading, inasmuch as this mental, this undifferentiated consciousness is not in space and time, and it does not have the characteristics of a material medium. Nevertheless, we have to, simply because we do not have the necessary vocabulary, to speak in these sort of terms. We have to use analogies with vortices. Well, it is as though we were persistent vortices within a medium, And I think we have to postulate that by our experience in the embodied state, we build up these particular awarenesses within the general undifferentiated awareness, and that we leave certain traces in the form of persistent vortices upon the undifferentiated medium. So these things go on. Now, the question then arises, what are these vortices within the undifferentiated awareness? Here there's some, I think we find some very interesting suggestions from the Oxford philosopher H.H. Price, who speaks of these different types of so to say, the molecules of awareness, which may be of any, the complexes of awareness may be of any size, so to speak, from a single idea, from a haunting, for example, to go back to the question of survival, this purely non-personal thing which seems to remain attached to a certain place, up to a large fragment of a personality, and perhaps to a complete personality. Now, we pronounce this word personality, and it's a word we use very glibly, but when we come to examine exactly what it means, we are confronted by very great difficulties. What precisely is a personality? When we look closely at personalities, our own or other people, what do we find? Well, I think the first thing that we are struck by is that any given personality is certainly not a monolithic unity. The personality is a good deal more loosely bundled together than we ordinarily think. And it is a non-unitary thing. It is made of disparate elements, both in its temporal extension and in its cross-section. In its temporal extension, obviously we change very considerably as we grow older. But it is not merely a question of maturation that changes the personality. It's quite clear, if we look at the history of almost any life, that there may be profound changes of the personality brought about by particular circumstances. I mean, let us take a hypothetical case of a child whose mother dies, and who, from having been a happy and completely healthy personality, becomes a very wretched and neurotic personality. I mean, here is a startling change in the nature of the personality. Similarly, changes of surroundings, casual meetings, may make the most profound difference to people. I mean, one often hears of cases of people who seem to be almost moronic, who suddenly find what their talents are, what they can do. A chance meeting opens up a new world for them, and from having been practically idiotic, they become alert and intelligent and efficient, and one sees that there is a profound change in the personality. And after all, it's one of the commonplaces of religious literature that certain types of religious experience will produce immense changes in personality. That the whole attitude towards life, towards other human beings, the whole way of behaving will change profoundly, and consequently, the whole stock of memories, which obviously become extremely important in the problem of survival, will be totally changed. And similarly, in the cross-sections of a personality at any given time, there are again, obviously, disparate elements brought together. After all, there is the conscious and the unconscious, there is the rational and the childish in human beings, there is the respectable persona and the generally rather disreputable psychophysiological reality which lies beneath it. All these things are there as very loosely connected bits of the personality. So it leads us to ask, what exactly do we mean by a personality? Do we mean what I think I am, or what I would wish to be, or what the Freudian analyst interprets me as being, or what my friends think I am? There are obviously a great many ways in which a personality can be thought about. And then, on top of everything else, we have to remember that there are in every personality immense numbers of, an indefinite number, I think, of potentialities which might have been developed in other circumstances, but which in the particular circumstances of the life have not been developed. So that over and above all the other enigmas of personality, there is this immense enigma of the might have been, the fact that we carry about immense latent potentialities which have not in fact been actualized, but which might have been actualized. Well, now, from this, let us return to the question of survival. Now let us assume that the evidence which points to something surviving is valid. Now the question arises, what is it that is actually surviving? Now I would agree with Professor C.D. Broad, who is one of the rather few philosophers who has really taken the trouble to study the literature of psychical research with great care and has devoted a lot of speculation to the problem. I would agree with Professor Broad in thinking that in most cases, certainly, what survives and what comes through in the communications with the medium or the recipient is perhaps not a complete personality, whatever exactly that may be, but is rather a fragment of a personality. That a piece comes through and establishes some kind of communication with the recipient in life. And in this case, we would have to assume that these traces left in the psychic medium, these surviving vortices, have some sort of power of establishing communication with the percipient, and sometimes bringing through some kind of juridical
Alright, that chime in the background was the finishing of Aldous Huxley's almost 5-hour talk, or series of talks, What a Piece of Work Man Is. Soon to be premiering on my YouTube channel, and this is going to take at least another session, so I'm going to break this off here, take a break, and then get back to it. Take 2 coming up. Okay, so Aldous Huxley's What a Piece of Work is Man is now premiering and playing. It's about 4 hours, 45 minutes or so. Eidolon thinks she wants to go outside again, but as soon as I open the door, she's going to change her mind because it's pretty icy and nasty today. So I'm going to just let her say Mao now and let it be. So here we go. Now it's a little bit of a problem here in the composition, where I'm going to wrap these heads smaller as they approach under her elbow so that I can increase the size of this row of heads, which will then overlap the point of the pinched row of faces. that start the spiral and then increase in size as it widens. So that's going to be a little tricky, but I think we can do it. Here we go.
Anything above our ordinary level of intelligence, any remarkable action or great insight is given to us from the outside by a God who hands out his men off to us. And the God sometimes has a name. We know which God is at work within us. But occasionally, and this is particularly true in the Odyssey, the God has no name. He is just called a daimon. He is some sort of a supernatural being. And in general, in Greek, until much later times, any supernatural being to whom one couldn't give a name, Zeus or Aphrodite or Athene, it was just called a daimon. For example, the monitions which Socrates received were given him by a daimon, a nameless supernatural being. And it is interesting to note that Socrates, who is after all the father of Western rationalism, says in so many words, the greatest blessings come to us by way of madness, provided always that the madness is given to us as a divine gift, so that he himself recognized this supernatural influx which constantly influenced human beings. Now, Homer's daimons and gods are not mere fairy tale fantasies. They are principles of scientific explanation. He had to account for the very odd facts of human psychology, the fact that human beings are constantly doing things which are obviously against their interests, which they know to be stupid and bad. Similarly, they every now and then do things which seem to be far beyond their normal capacities of action or thought. And it seemed quite rational in the absence of any other hypothesis. I mean, such a hypothesis as we have now of the dynamic unconscious. It was only rational to suppose that these strange events of which we are all conscious were due to the influx of supernatural powers. And it's interesting to realize that this idea of possession for good or for ill by supernatural powers went on being used as a principle of explanation right on almost to the end of the 17th century. But contemporary with Galileo and even with Newton, we find this Homeric idea of possession being used currently as an explanation of many forms of many of the odder forms of human behavior. You will find, for example, in that compendium of 17th century psychology, the Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, an extremely good discussion of this whole problem. I mean, she points out that most cases of strange behavior and madness, and what we would call neurosis, most cases have a physical origin, but quite a good proportion of them are probably due to some kind of supernatural possession. And it's very interesting to notice that in the 18th century, when the idea of demonic possession had completely evaporated, nothing was brought in to take its place. We have a curious kind of interregnum, so to speak, in the history of psychology during the 18th and early 19th centuries, when the stranger aspects of human nature simply had no valid explanatory principles to account for them. For example, when the case of Mesmer was examined by the French Academy, with the assistance of Benjamin Franklin. The only explanation they could bring up for the strange phenomena which occurred in Mesmer's neighborhood was imagination. Well, imagination, such as we know it, quite clearly doesn't account for the kind of queer things which were happening in these early days of the hypnotic experimentation. And strangely enough, it is not until quite late in the 19th century that a satisfactory substitute for the old idea of possession comes into the world. It comes in, of course, with the development of the idea of a dynamic, unconscious self, what would be called the unconscious and the pre-conscious, or in general, the subliminal self. And the opening of the new period of psychology is dated by William James with the publication of a paper by F.W.H. Myers in, I think, 1882. So that it is extraordinarily recent that we have any satisfactory substitute for this ancient Homeric and afterwards Christian idea of demonic and divine possession as agents to account for the odder aspects of human behavior. Now, let us pass now for a moment to the practical side of Greek psychology. The Greeks were very realistic people, and they knew very well that the more distressing aspects, the more distressing consequences of possession could be warded off if some kind of satisfaction, either direct or indirect, were found for the instinctive drives and the frustrations and miseries of normal life. And the two great methods which they used, but to both of which they applied the term catharsis, the first of them, historically, was the method of the Dionysian orgy and dance. Dionysus, in this context, was called Lucios, the liberator, and he did liberate these people who lived an extraordinarily miserable life if they were slaves, from a great deal of their sense of frustration and unhappiness by, first of all, giving them alcohol, and in the second place, encouraging these congregational dances. At a later period, the Dionysian rites seemed to lose their interest, but their place was taken by the Corybantic dances in honor of the Great Mother. And here there was a specifically therapeutic value was set upon these dances. For example, the people suffering from what we would now call anxiety syndromes or various types of neurosis were actually diagnosed by the way they responded to certain types of music, and in this way one could judge what daimon or god was possessing them, and suitable dances and religious rites were then prescribed for them, and they worked off in this way a great deal of the neurotic tension which was upsetting them. At this time, in the present day, of course, in many parts of the world, one can find exactly the same procedures being carried out. I was greatly struck, for example, 2 years ago when I was in Brazil, by what may be called the Latin American Minerism of what is called in Rio Macumba and what is called in Bahia Candomblé, which are essentially adaptations of West African dances. And
when you go and see these, one sees very clearly what the Greeks were up to and how effective this kind of therapy was. These unfortunate Negroes living in the most frightful conditions in the favelas of Rio or of Bahia, on Saturday nights work off their sense of frustration and misery by this night-long dancing. And interestingly enough, in all the dances that I witnessed, there was no question of alcohol involved. The whole procedure was one of this tremendous muscular activity through which immense accumulations of tension and misery were worked off, and by the end of the night many of the participants, of course, had fallen down in a kind of ecstatic stupor and were prepared to go on with their miserable life during the following week. And it was, to me, very, very interesting to see in these dances actual gestures which are exactly described in the Greek literature about the Maenads. The tossing of the head, for example, which occurs again and again in descriptions of Maenadism in Greece, was clearly exemplified in the candomblé and macumba dances. There was a great deal of this tossing, which I imagine the physiological reason for which is that it drives a great deal of blood into the head by a centrifugal force, and probably produces this kind of ecstatic state very rapidly. Now, come back to the possession theory. The interesting thing about it is that subjectively this is a very realistic theory, because quite clearly these sudden impulses, either for evil or for good, are experienced subjectively as alien impulses. After all, we see this constantly in our idiomatic use of language. We say, "What came over me? I can't have been myself at the moment," and things like this. Or a good idea occurred to me. We never say, "I have invented a good idea." We say, "It has come to me, it has occurred to me." There is this subjective sense that it does come to us. And in this sense, the possession idea was an extremely realistic one, until one had a better theory, such as we have, or we think we have anyhow. This seemed to be the most sensible explanation of both normal and abnormal behavior. The idea being that there was a self which was invaded from the outside by these alien supernatural forces and was made to do things, either evil things or exceptionally good things, of which the normal self would be quite incapable. And now let us briefly consider, how did Homer envisage the self that was invaded from the outside? He did not envisage it as a unitary soul or personality. There is no word in Homer for the soul. The psyche, he speaks of the psyche, but the psyche is something which exists only at the moment of death. It's the thing that leaves the body and that will become the future shade which people can contact if they go down to Hades. But during life, the psyche is not there at all. During life, the self is a kind of symbiosis of a number of psychophysiological factors, working together and living in a rather uneasy consensus and organization, rather unstable and rather uncomfortable all the time. And the factors which Homer describes as being components of the self are, first of all, they're these half physiological factors. There's something which he calls the thumos, which is the seat of feeling which lives in the chest. And then there is the frame, which quite literally is the midriff, which is the organ of passion and of life. Then there is the nous, which is the reasonable, sensible ego, more or less. We would call it, I suppose, the ego. But anyhow, it is the reasonable side of man. And then there is the heart, which fulfills more or less the same kind of functions as the heart does in colloquial language today, and also the belly, which is quite important. So that we see there is this kind of committee which works. And the I, the nous, is merely one member of this committee, not necessarily the chairman. He is there, and he may be at the mercy of the other members of the committee, or he may control them, but it's never quite certain which position he will occupy. And one of the things which is striking in the Homeric psychology is that there is no word for will, no conception of will. In this, the Homeric psychology closely resembles the Hindu and Buddhist psychology, where will plays a completely negligible part. It seems to us very strange to get on without the idea of a will, and yet one can do it. For example, I mean, take the marriage service. Wilt thou have this woman to be thy wife? Well, instead of saying, I will, we can say, well, my thumos is all for it, and so is my frame. My nous has certain misgivings, but I'm prepared to go along with what the others say. All the more so as I feel distinct symptoms of possession by Aphrodite. I mean, this is an answer which we could sum up in terms of will, and perhaps in some ways is more realistic than our idea of the will doing something. And it's worth quoting in this context a remark by an eminent historian of ideas, Professor Nielsen, who says that pluralistic thinking about the nature of the soul is founded in the nature of things, and only our habits of thought make it surprising that man should have several souls. Well, Homer, as I've said before, was not a philosopher, nor a psychologist, but a very good observer, and his view of the personality built up out of these multiple factors is a workable one, and interestingly enough, it's remarkably close in some ways to the Buddhist conception, which was developed, I suppose, about 3 or 4 centuries after Homer, and which was developed, of course, much more systematically by philosophical writers. But there, you see, the Buddhist conception specifically affirms that man is anatta, that he has no unitary soul, and that his personality is this group of loosely conjoined complexes, which in Buddhist literature are called skandhas. And they point out that all the phenomena of human behavior and thought can be explained in terms of these skandhas,
Leaves me with 8 minutes to finish up that little section. I don't know if I can do that. We're going to try.
Partly psychological, you can't really separate the two. It's interesting to note that in the last 75 years, there has been in the West a considerable current returning towards the Homeric and Buddhist idea of man, away from the idea of the unitary soul and towards the idea of a consensus of numerous factors coming together. This view has been discussed by Bertrand Russell in various places, and he says, I quote here, he says that from this view of human personality, it does not follow that there is no simple self. It only follows that we cannot know whether there is or not, and that the self, except as a bundle of perceptions, cannot enter into any part of our knowledge. Well, this is certainly, if Homer had thought about the philosophy of what he was saying, I think he would have completely agreed with Bertrand Russell that man was a bundle of elements. And of course, Bertrand Russell was preceded in this by Hume. Now, it's a very interesting fact that the ideas of Homer did not persist into classical times in Greece. Within 3 to 4 centuries after Homer's death, it seemed self-evident to Greek philosophers and to all thinking men in Greece that there was a unitary soul and that it inhabited the body. The idea of the multiple causation, the multiple factors which made up a personality, had given place to this idea of a psyche imprisoned within the body. Now, recent scholarship has suggested that the reason for this transition from the older idea of a multiple, loosely federated personality to the idea of the unitary soul, that the influence which produced this in Greece came not from the Orient, as used to be supposed, but rather came from the north, from the Scythians and from the shamanistic religion of the north. The Greeks had founded their first colonies on the Black Sea in the 7th century BC, and had come into contact with the Scythians, whose religion was the same as that which still persists in large parts of Central Asia and in Siberia, the shamanistic religion, or rather which did persist until it had been, in very recent years, been replaced by Marxism. And this idea of the unitary soul, which came in with the shamanistic ideas, is based upon the fact that the shamanistic religion depends really on the activities of these specially gifted people who performed feats of what in modern mediumistic literature is called traveling clairvoyance. In this respect, the shamans were quite different from the sibyls and prophetesses of Greece. These were possessed by the god, the Delphic oracle. She sat upon the tripod and was possessed. She was, the word enthusiasm, of course, which we use in a slightly different sense, means literally having the god inside you. And the prophetess had the god inside her, and the god spoke through her. Well, something exactly contrary took place in the shamanistic religion. Instead of summoning the god in, the shaman went into a mediumistic trance and went out and explored the external world, both on its mundane level and on its supernatural levels, looking for facts here below and looking for the deities on the higher sphere. Well, obviously, if this naturally leads to the conception of a unitary soul, if you can go out and wander about the world, there is something that goes out. You can't speak about a bundle of unrelated, not closely related factors going out. You have to think of this unitary personage going out into the world. And I don't think we have to discuss whether traveling clairvoyance...
All right, a minute 57 seconds to spare. Groovy. Well, at least for the first spiraling layer that overlaps the little pointed piece that kind of comes under her elbow there of the first layer and starts the second layer development, which will wrap around the first layer. So, and then the third and the fourth. We'll see how big it gets and how far it goes, but it's going to be a little tricky to do all that in one session, so I think I'm just going to cut it here for the moment and pick it up with the same color possibly tomorrow, unless I go to town, in which case maybe tomorrow evening. But in any case, that's it for the moment. So thank you for watching. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Medusa's crown. So I can zoom in right there, kind of pan up and around.
Other parts of
you can
this
see it
world,
pretty good.
and in unknown
Kind of got a
areas
glare on
of
it.
other worlds, so that
But anyway, interlocking eyes
it
kind of change and morph expressions as it wraps around. It's
And
fun.
another significant fact,
And those will all be, lit and shadowed and developed along with the central figure as the painting goes forward.
Part of their power was due to the fact that they had
I'm going to go console my cat. She thinks I made it rain.
and they could
Have a good night,
remember
Earth.
this, and they carried this